It seems to happen like clockwork. As soon as a warranty runs out, things break and they're no longer covered. When your car is in that situation, though, you could be staring down thousands of dollars in repair bills. CarShield begins where your warranty ends, with service plans that cover those expensive surprises. They pay your favorite mechanic or dealership directly, making the entire process fast and easy. Get a free quote by calling 800-416-6522 or visit carshield.com to get your free quote.
Shortly after Thanksgiving in 1987, an intruder broke into the Tucker residence in Arlington, Virginia. It might have been just another statistic, but the crime committed that night launched a new era in police investigations. This is how DNA evidence and psychological profiling helped catch a serial killer and set an innocent man free.
Everything about her was very gentle. She was very soft-spoken. She just had this amazing softness about her, this human quality.
44-year-old Susan Tucker was a publications editor who worked for the United States Forestry Service. She was spending the Thanksgiving holiday alone since her husband Reggie was out of the country in Wales on a business trip.
Neither of us could put the phone down. We kept saying, "I love you." And we said this over and over again. I don't know how many times.
But without explanation, telephone calls went unanswered. And neighbors noticed her bedroom window wide open in the cold November weather, so they called police. As they approached the front door, they noticed it was ajar. Inside, a woman's purse was lying on the foyer floor. Susan Tucker's badly decomposed body was lying face down on the bed. She had been dead for 4 or 5 days.
Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet were tied, the head hanging over the side of the bed almost.
She had been strangled and possibly raped.
It appeared that the killer more than likely was inside the home for quite some time. I mean, it wasn't just a very, quick in and out type of a situation. Many of the drawers had been, ransacked, had been gone through.
When Reggie Tucker heard the news, he was devastated.
My whole world just fell away.
Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington Police Homicide Unit was quickly assigned to the case. His task wouldn't be easy. For one thing, the killer had been careful. He had worn gloves and left no fingerprints.
Hey, this has been wiped clean.
It had been raining on the night of the murder, and he meticulously cleaned the area around his point of entry.
He's smart enough to know that footprints, which is what we would have gotten from that, would maybe come back to haunt him, which kind of tells you maybe some past experience on burglaries.
Police collected the sheets, nightgown, and the large sleeping bag which covered Susan Tucker's body to look for possible blood and semen stains. They found hairs on the bedding around Susan Tucker's body, in the bathroom sink, and on a washcloth discovered outside on the clothesline. And they gathered shards of broken glass from the basement window. Everything was taken to the forensics lab for analysis, but perhaps the most important clue was also the most obvious: the rope and knots used to strangle Susan Tucker. The police were convinced they had seen this killer's work before. 3 years earlier, a 34-year-old lawyer named Carolyn Hom had been raped and strangled in her home only 4 blocks away from Susan Tucker. The killer entered the Hom residence the same way, through a basement window, and tied his victim using the same knots.
And it's not a common occurrence, not common at all, to see victims killed by using ligatures to strangle them, ropes tying up victims. It's really quite rare.
But the Hom case was closed when this man, David Vasquez, confessed to her murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Could he have had an accomplice? Horgus spoke to him for several hours.
And from the way he was talking and everything and answering my questions, I didn't think he knew a damn thing about Carolyn Hom's murder.
While Detective Horgus began his search for Susan Tucker's killer, 100 miles away in the capital city of Richmond, police there were investigating a series of murders shockingly similar.
The body of 35-year-old Debbie Davis was found inside her South Richmond apartment. She'd been raped and strangled.
In less than a month, 2 young women had been raped and strangled in their homes just a few blocks from each other.
In each case, there was a forced entry with the murderer entering by cutting the screens and entering through an open window. Each victim was strangled. Both victims were white, between the ages of 30 and 35 years.
2 weeks later, he struck again, this time a 15-year-old girl raped and strangled in her bedroom while her family was sleeping. All 3 had been bound, raped, and strangled with rope. The knots were identical to the ones used in the Arlington cases. Detective Horgus suspected that the killer of Susan Tucker was the same man who murdered Carolyn Hom and the 3 women in Richmond. If Horgus was correct, a serial murderer was loose on a 100-mile killing spree. Detective Horgus believed the man who raped and strangled Susan Tucker had also murdered Carolyn Hom 3 years earlier. Horgus also believed the same man was responsible for the 3 rapes and murders in Richmond, 100 miles away. The Richmond police weren't so sure.
I mean, they have 3 murders that were within a couple miles square radius, I'm guessing, or maybe even less, that, you know, and now we're trying to say that 100 miles away, we're trying to link something to theirs. It's like, hey, get out of here. I mean, this is a local guy.
Horgus was a man, he was the perfect man for this case because he was obsessed. He knew something was wrong.
Author Paul Moniz wrote a best-selling book entitled Stalking Justice. It profiles the rapes and murders of these 5 women and the history-making investigation which followed.
Joe Horgus is motivated by the hunt. He's not a guy who's obsessed by issues of right and wrong, except for his own internal moral compass, which tells him if there's an innocent man in prison, I don't care if we got the guilty guy, we got to get the innocent man out. And he was determined to get this guy.
But if Horgus was right, that all of these murders were connected, he needed proof. For that, he turned to the forensics lab, where scientists were examining the stains found on Susan Tucker's nightgown and bedding.
I found 4 semen stains, and when I analyzed the sleeping bag, I found 1 very large semen stain. I typed all of those stains.
The semen came from an individual with type O blood and a PGM1 enzyme profile. Although this matched 13% of the population, it also matched the semen found at the Carolyn Hom murder scene. Next, they turned their attention to the hair found at the Tucker crime scene.
And there are characteristics, microscopically, that can classify hair into one of 3 racial categories,
which are Caucasian, Negroid, or Mongoloid. The hairs found at the Tucker crime scene appeared to be pubic and did not appear to be from the victim or her husband. They were positively identified as Negroid in origin. This was another possible link to the Carolyn Hom murder case. 3 years earlier, at the time of Hom's murder, a black male wearing a mask had raped a number of women in the same neighborhood. The masked rapist was never apprehended, and Horgus always suspected that there was a connection to the Hom murder.
Actually, the same day that Carolyn Hom's body was found, another girl, lady, was in her house, and this black male with a mask and a knife burglarized her house, got her, and actually he did some sexual activity with her.
The Richmond police and later the Arlington police both sought help from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. This unit has interviewed hundreds of serial killers to learn what similarities exist in their psychological makeup. They were able to predict a number of important things about the killer.
We get in and look at the behavior that's left by the offender in the commission of his crime. We believe that by looking at that behavior, we can interpret the type of offender that may have committed the crime.
The fact that the strangler attacked his victims in their homes suggested that he had stalked them first and knew precisely when to strike. The FBI concluded that the perpetrator was between the age of 18 and 30, the quiet type, a loner who held a menial job. He probably had a troubled relationship with his mother and began his crime spree with arson. Historically, many serial rapists and murderers begin with arson. Serial killers are usually white, but could be any race. He lived or worked close to where he committed his first crimes. That's because criminals begin their crime sprees in an area where they feel most comfortable. He took sadistic pleasure in strangling his victims. He would periodically release the bindings so he could hear his victim plead for her life.
It appeared that the perpetrator had intended the victim to suffer considerably. In one case, a shoe impression was found on the victim's back.
And it's not clear whether they were dead when he did this or alive, but he also masturbated on his victims.
And it was these semen samples which would prove to be extremely important pieces of evidence.
I can remember our prosecutor, Helen Fahey, a couple of days after the murder, asking me if this was going to be a DNA case. And I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know what we had got yet.
In 1987, when Susan Tucker was murdered, DNA evidence was still in its infancy. The first time DNA evidence was used in a criminal case was only a year earlier in England, when DNA from a semen sample was used to convict a bakery worker with the rape and murder of two 15-year-old girls. Horgus decided to try this new DNA testing, sending the semen stains from Susan Tucker's nightgown to the Life Codes laboratory in New York. The final results from the DNA tests would take up to 10 weeks, but Detective Horgus still didn't have a suspect.
This program is brought to you by Generation Y, a podcast from Wondery. Imagine you have two friends who are obsessed with stories of crime, murder, and unsolved mysteries. That is Generation Y, a podcast where hosts Aaron and Justin explore theories, dive into forensic evidence, and share their opinions. In an all-new episode, Generation Y examines the case of Jonathan Amaral, a 25-year-old biomedical engineer in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. One weekend, he goes off on a hiking trip. He never comes back. After Jonathan fails to show up for work, his mother finds out and reports him missing. That same day, Brittany Barron, who is 31 and one of Jonathan's coworkers, calls in to quit her job, and now she's missing too. Jonathan and Brittany are rumored to be having an affair. So did the two run off together, or has something more sinister happened? Listen to the Generation Y podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, or you can listen 1 week early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app.
Detective Horgus suspected that the same individual who raped and murdered Susan Tucker and Carolyn Hom 3 years earlier was the masked rapist who was committing crimes in the same area but was never caught. So Horgus drove out to an area of Arlington known as Green Valley, the area where the masked rapist committed his first assaults. The FBI told Horgus that rapists usually commit their first crime close to home.
If the first rape was the first rape for this guy, then he would have lived around there, and that was very crucial to me because I didn't know that.
And as he drove through Green Valley, Horgus tried to recall the names or faces of likely suspects, young men he'd run across.